A greedy cousin sold the girl's only coat and locked her in the cold smokehouse. The smokehouse door had a hasp on it and a padlock the size of my fist. That's the first thing I noticed. Not the cold, though the cold was something, that November, 8 below and dropping, not the sound from inside which came through the gap at the bottom of the door and reached me before anything else did. Just that lock. Brand new, bright brass. Every other piece of hardware on that ranch had 20 years of rust and neglect on it. And here was this lock shining like it had been bought yesterday and hung that morning with a purpose. I had stopped at the Holt place to ask after a gray mule I'd sold them in September, which hadn't come back with the right papers. That was all. A 10-minute stop on a 2-day haul between Deering and the lower settlements. I had a freight wagon loaded with salt pork, lamp oil, and 3 crates of window glass that I needed to get down the canyon road before the temperature dropped any further, because glass and freeze don't agree. The main house was dark. No smoke from the chimney. A horse I didn't recognize stood at the rail, blowing steam into the air. And this smokehouse, a low, squat structure set back from the barn with that lock, and under the door just barely a sound. I stood there for a moment. I am not a man who acts fast, generally speaking. I was 51 years old that November, and I'd spent 30 of those years in freight work, which teaches you that most of what looks like a problem from the road is somebody else's business, and none of yours. I'd learned that lesson more than once. There are men who stick their nose into things and men who haul their freight and mind themselves, and I had long since settled which kind I was going to be. But that sound, I couldn't tell you even now exactly what it was. Not screaming, not even crying, not exactly. It was the kind of sound you hear from something that has been making noise for a long while and has mostly given up on being heard. The kind of sound that has gone quiet inside itself, low and steady as a creek running under ice. I knocked on the smokehouse door. I don't know why I knocked, force of habit maybe. The sound stopped. I said, "Anybody in there?" Nothing for a long moment, then a voice careful and thin, "Who's asking?" I told her my name, Caleb Marsh out of Deering Freight, said I'd done business with the Holts before. Another pause, then, "The Holts aren't here, it's just my cousin Ruford and his wife, and they've gone to town." I asked her how long she'd been in there. She said, "Since yesterday morning." I stood outside that door in the cold, and looked at the lock and looked at the road, and looked at the lock again. I had glass to deliver. 3 ranches were waiting on those windows, one of them a schoolhouse that had been open to the weather since October. I had a schedule. I had obligations. I went to my wagon and got the pry bar. Her name was Nora Holt. She was 23 years old, though she looked younger or maybe older, depending on which part of her face you were looking at. Her eyes were older. The rest of her was young and thin, and shaking so hard her teeth clicked together when she tried to talk. She'd been in there since the previous morning with nothing to eat and nothing but a burlap sack she'd found hanging on a nail and wrapped around herself. And the cold in that stone smokehouse had gotten into her in a way that takes hours to get back out of. I didn't ask questions right away. I got her to the wagon, got her up on the box seat, got my own coat off. I had a canvas barn coat over a wool shirt, and I kept the shirt and wrapped her in it. I had a tin of cold coffee in my gear kit, and I held it while she drank because her hands weren't working right yet. The Holts she'd mentioned, the ones who weren't there, were her uncle and aunt. The ranch belonged to them. Nora had come out from Missouri after her mother died, which had been the previous spring. She'd had nothing to come back to in Missouri, she said, and her uncle had written to her and said there was a place for her here. What she'd found when she arrived in June was that her uncle had died in April and his wife had moved back to her own people in Kansas, and the ranch had passed by some arrangement. She still wasn't clear on the exact arrangement, to her uncle's nephew on his side, a man named Ruford Peel, who was no blood of hers at all. Ruford and his wife Cecile had let her stay on, working in the house. She'd done it because she had nowhere else to go and no money and no horse and no real sense yet of what the country out here was like or how to move through it. She'd worked all summer and into fall. She'd asked about wages twice and been told twice that her board and keep was her wages, which she'd accepted because what choice did she have? Then 3 weeks ago a traveling coat merchant had come through. Nora's one winter coat, the one she'd brought from Missouri, gray wool, her mother's before hers, had gone out to that merchant's wagon before she'd even been asked. Ruford had sold it, $7.50, which he'd put in his own pocket without mentioning it to her. When she'd said something about it, she hadn't even argued, she said. She just asked what she was supposed to do for a coat now. Winter coming. Cecile had told her she had no right to complain about arrangements made by the man of the house. And Ruford had told her she was a mouth to feed and no kind of worker, and she ought to be grateful for the roof. The smokehouse was what happened when she'd pushed back a second time. She told me all of this in pieces, over an hour, as her shaking slowed down and the color came back into her face. She wasn't asking for anything while she told it. She wasn't crying. She said it the way you report something that happened, matter-of-factly, like she'd already used up whatever feeling she had about it, and what was left was just the shape of events. I listened. I did not say much. I drove the wagon up the road about half a mile while she talked, because I wanted distance between us and that ranch before Ruford came back from wherever he was, and I wanted to think. When she got to the end of it, she went quiet for a while and I drove, and the road bent down toward the canyon, and the air got a little less sharp as we dropped out of the wind. Then she said, "I don't suppose you'd know of any work, in Deering or wherever you're going. I can cook and I can keep house and I can do accounts. My mother taught me figures." I thought about it for a while, not the way people think when they're deciding whether to be generous, the practical way. I thought about my warehouse in Deering, which had no cook and no one doing accounts, because I'd been doing accounts myself for 6 years and doing them badly, and eating bread and dried meat out of my own freight loads because I was on the road more than I was off it. I thought about the town of Deering and whether there was decent lodging for a woman alone, and there wasn't, not the kind that cost what she could afford, which was nothing. I thought about what would happen if I dropped her in Deering with nothing, and no one and no coat. And then I stopped thinking about it and told her I had a storage room above my warehouse office that I used to sleep in when I was in town, which she could have, and that I did in fact need someone to manage the office, which she could also have, and that I would pay $4 a month in her keep. She looked at me for a long time when I said that. She said, "Why?" I said because I needed the help, which was true. She said, "You don't know me." I said that was correct, but I'd known people for 20 years who couldn't be trusted, and I tended to judge on what I'd seen for myself rather than on length of acquaintance. And what I'd seen for myself was a woman who'd held herself together for 18 hours in a freezing smokehouse without losing her mind, which told me most of what I needed to know. She didn't say anything to that for a while. Then she said, $4 is low. And something in my chest that had been sitting still for quite a long time shifted and settled differently. I said $4.50. She said she'd think about it. I drove on. The canyon road in November, late in the day, is something you don't forget if you've driven it. The walls come up on both sides and the light drops out early and you can hear the river down below even when you can't see it, a sound like the whole bottom of the world is breathing. The cold off the walls has a different weight to it than open country cold. It sits on you. Nora had stopped shaking by the time we hit the canyon. She'd gotten some blood back in her and was sitting up straight, my coat still around her, watching the walls go by with the particular attention of someone who hasn't seen much and is trying to see everything. Not scared, just watching. We had one load to drop at Fells Creek before the canyon proper, window glass for the Alderman Ranch, and when I pulled up to that gate and started to get down, Nora got down first and went to the tailgate without being asked and started working the lashings on the crate. She knew rope. Whoever had taught her, they'd taught her right. Old Alderman's wife came out when she heard the wagon and stood there watching us unload. She was 60, white-haired, with the kind of face that had been pretty once and was now just sharp. She looked at Nora. Then she looked at me. I said, "This is my office manager, Nora Holt," and we went back to unloading. Alderman's wife asked us in for coffee and we went, because you don't turn down coffee in November and you don't insult the ranchers you need to stay friendly with. Nora sat at that kitchen table and drank her coffee, and when old Mrs. Alderman, whose name was Vera, started talking about the accounts her husband couldn't make head nor tail of, Nora asked to see them. She spent 20 minutes with those accounts while Vera and I drank a second cup and talked about weather and the roads. Then she laid them out on the table and showed Vera where her husband had been double recording feed costs against the cattle column, which made it look like the ranch was running short when it wasn't, and she showed her the correction and wrote it out clear. Vera Alderman looked at me after that. I didn't say anything. She said to Nora, "Where'd you learn figures like that?" Nora said, "My mother was a bookkeeper in Missouri. She taught me young." We left the Alderman ranch with $6 extra. Vera had pressed it on Nora directly, not on me, for the accounts work, and a wool cloak that had been her daughter's and didn't fit anyone in the house anymore, and 2 jars of preserved pears. Nora sat back on the wagon box with the cloak over my coat and the pears in her lap, and didn't say anything for a long while. Then she said, "I'll take the job, if the $450 is still on the table." I said it was. She said, "And I want it clear from the start what the work is and what it isn't. Office and accounts, that's the work." I said, "Understood." She said, "Good." And that was that. We got to the bottom of the canyon after dark. I had a camp spot I used, a rock shelf out of the wind with a good fire ring already laid from years of use, and I pulled the wagon up to it and unhitched the horses and built a fire while Nora went through my camp box and found the meal bag and the iron pan. She made cornbread in that pan the way her mother had shown her, she said, with a little bacon fat and a pinch of salt, and we ate it hot off the pan with the dried meat I had in my kit, and the fire was good and the rock cut the wind and it was, considering, not a bad place to be. After a while she said, "What happened to the people you had doing the accounts before?" I said there hadn't been anyone, I'd done them myself. She asked what that had been like. I said it had been about as good as me doing accounts generally was, which was not very good. She almost smiled at that, not quite. A thing moved at the corner of her mouth and then stopped, like it had started and then thought better of it, but I saw it. I had not made a woman almost smile in a long time. I poked the fire and didn't make anything of it. She asked about the freight work, how far I ran, how many loads a season, what the roads were like in spring, practical questions. She was already working it out in her head. I could tell what the business looked like, where the numbers would come from. She asked if I had a ledger and I said I had 3 and none of them were current, and she winced like she'd stepped on something sharp. She said 3. I said, 1 for each of the last 3 years, more or less. She said, "Are they in the same book?" I said, "No, they're 3 different books." She said something under her breath that I didn't quite catch, and was probably not polite. I said I had tried to keep them current, but there were periods on the road when it wasn't practical, and then I'd come home and try to reconstruct, and it had not always gone well. She looked at me across the fire with an expression I would come to know well, which was the expression of someone confronting a problem that is large but solvable and trying to decide how they feel about it. She said, "I'm going to need at least a week when we get there, just for the books." I said, "Take what you need." She said, "And a new ledger. These ones sound like they need to be sources, not the actual ledger." I said I would get her one. She said, "Good." She ate the last piece of cornbread and wrapped herself in the cloak and lay down near the fire and went to sleep. And I sat there a while longer watching the fire burn down, and I thought about how the day had started, and how it had ended, and how the shape of a day could change so completely that you got to the other end of it and didn't recognize the morning from where you were standing. I was not a man who believed in providence or fate or any of that. 30 years of freight work had stripped most of that out of me. Things happened and then other things happened, and whether they added up to something was mostly a story you told yourself afterward. But I sat there that night and thought about that lock, the brass lock on the smokehouse, bright and new and hung with a purpose, and how I had stood outside it and made the ordinary decision, the one any decent man would have made, the one I might not have made 10 years ago when I was harder about other people's trouble, and I thought, well, just well. I turned the fire down and pulled my bedroll and slept. Deering was not a large town. It had a main street and 2 side streets and about 300 people in the winter months, more in summer when the range crews came through. My warehouse sat at the north end of Main Street, which was the unfashionable end, close to the stock pens. It had a loading dock and an office off the back, and above the office, a room I'd built out for myself over the summer, which had a window and a wood stove and was tight against the weather. I showed Nora the office and the room and the 3 ledgers on the same afternoon we arrived. She looked at the room, which had my things in it, my kit bag and my extra boots and a shelf of almanacs and survey maps, and she looked at me. I said I would sleep in the office when I was in town. There was a cot. She said that was her problem to solve, not mine, and she'd find lodging in town. I said the only lodging in town was the Deering Hotel, which was $12 a month and had bedbugs, or the boarding house on Sutter Street, which was $8 and had no bedbugs but also no heat above the 2nd floor, and she was on the 3rd. She said, so $8. I said, from a $4.50 salary. She looked at me. I said the room was there and it was clean and heated and she was welcome to it. I had a curtain I could hang in the office doorway for privacy when I was in. When I was on the road, which was most of the time, the whole building was hers. I said it plain and practical, the same way I'd offered the job, because that was the only way I knew how to say things. She thought about it for one day. Then she moved into the room above the office, and I moved the cot into the office, and that was how the winter was arranged. The ledgers, as it turned out, were worse than either of us had let on. The 3 books covered 38 months, and they did not agree with each other on any significant point. Not on how many loads I'd run, not on what I'd charged, not on what I'd paid out for horses and feed and equipment. There was one period of 6 months in the middle of the 2nd year where I had apparently simply stopped recording anything and was working from memory. Nora did not say much about this. She sat in the office with a pot of coffee and a new ledger I'd bought her, and a stack of receipts I'd saved in a wood box under the desk, which were not in any order, and she worked through it. I watched her the first morning, and then I stopped watching because she'd looked at me twice in a way that meant she needed the space, and I found I minded her boundaries without needing to be told twice. She found things I hadn't known about my own business. She found that I'd been undercharging the Whitmore interests on their regular hauls by about 12% for 2 years, based on what comparable freighters in the territory were charging, and she showed me the numbers. She found that my horse feed costs had gone up 40 cents a month since the previous summer because I'd switched feed merchants without tracking the price change. She found that I'd paid for a new wagon wheel twice, once in my ledger and once in the receipt box, and that one of those payments was almost certainly wrong. It took her 9 days. At the end of 9 days, she had one clean ledger that started from scratch, with columns for income and outgoing and a running balance, and she had a letter ready for me to send to the Whitmore interests about the adjusted rate, which she had written in a clear hand on paper without a single cross-out. She set everything on the desk and sat back and said, "The business is sound. You're not rich, but you're not in trouble. The last 2 years you've turned a real profit each September, and then spent most of it on equipment in October, which is probably right for the work. If you stayed current with the ledger and charged Whitmore what you should be charging, you'd have a cushion by next fall. I sat across from her and looked at what 9 days of work had produced, which was the first clear picture I had had of my own business in 3 years, and I didn't have anything useful to say for a moment. Then I said, "You said cushion. What kind of cushion?" She said, $300 maybe. If the spring hauls come in at the same rate as last spring and you bring Whitmore current. I said, $300. She said, depending on weather and road conditions. I sat with that. I said, I should have found someone to do this a long time ago. She said, yes, you should have. She said it matter-of-factly, not unkindly but not softening it either, just the truth of it set down plain, and I felt something settle in me at that, not the numbers, not the $300, just the fact of being told the truth about my own affairs by someone who'd taken the trouble to actually understand them. That plain, direct accounting of where things stood and what they meant. I hadn't had that in years, maybe longer. I said, $450 doesn't seem right anymore. She looked at me. I said, for what you've just done, $450 a month doesn't seem right. She said, what are you suggesting? I said, $6, and after the Whitmore adjustment goes through, we look at it again. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, that's fair, and went back to work. I want to say something about what Nora was in those months, because it would be easy to tell it wrong, to make it into something it wasn't in those first weeks, which were two people learning a business arrangement and nothing more. She was not soft. She was not grateful in the way people are grateful when they've been rescued, which can become a kind of debt that sits heavy on both sides. She did not act like she owed me something she had to keep paying back. She acted like a woman who'd been put in a bad situation by other people's greed, and had found her way out of it, and was now, simply, working. What she was competent. Deeply, quietly competent in the way that people who have been responsible for themselves since they were young tend to be. She could read a room and read a person. She could track 6 things in her head at once. She never asked me a question she could find the answer to herself, and she never left something half done. She was also, under all of that, carrying something she didn't talk about and didn't put down. I knew it the way you know things when you've been in close quarters with someone for a while, not from anything she said, but from the way she was sometimes still in the evenings, looking at nothing, with her hands flat on the desk. From the way she woke in the night sometimes, and I could hear her moving around in the room above, and then going still again. From the careful distance she kept from anything personal, which was too careful to be natural, too deliberate. I didn't push at it. What business had I got pushing at someone else's edges? I knew my own well enough. December came and the weather held hard, and I was in town more than usual because the canyon road iced over and I wasn't moving freight through there in those conditions. I had a run to make north shorter, easier road, and I took it, was gone a week, and came back to find that Nora had taken on 2 outside jobs while I was away, billing work for the hardware merchant 2 doors down, and a weekly accounting for the Deering Hotel. Both had asked her, not the other way around. Mrs. Alderman had written to someone, apparently, and that someone had talked, and now there were 2 people in Deering who wanted Nora's figures work and were willing to pay for it. She told me this the way she reported anything, straightforwardly, and asked if I had any objection since it was on her own time and used the desk in the office. I said I had no objection. She said, the extra money goes to tools. I need a proper abacus and a better pen and a lock box for the cash receipts. I said, buy what you need and put it against the business. She said, this work isn't your business. I said, the abacus and the lock box are. The pen I'll argue about. She almost smiled again. This time I caught the whole of it before she put it away, a brief, real thing. There and then gone, but there. I turned to the mail on the desk and sorted it, and neither of us said anything for a while. And the wood stove ticked in the cold, and outside, the stock pens were quiet for once, and it was a decent evening. Ruford Peel came to Deering in January. I hadn't thought he would. I'd thought about the possibility and then dismissed it on the grounds that a man who locates his cousin in a freezing smokehouse for the crime of asking where her coat went is not generally a man who has the initiative to track her down. I'd been wrong. He came on a Thursday, mid-morning, when I was at the livery getting my second team shod. I didn't know he was in town until I got back to the warehouse at noon and found Nora standing in the middle of the office with the door locked from the inside, and Ruford Peel outside it, and his wife Cecile beside him, and Ruford's voice coming through the door with the particular quality of a man who spent his whole life being the loudest person in whatever room he's in. He was saying that Nora had taken a coat, his wife's coat, or something close to it. He was saying she'd left property behind, property that was rightfully his since the ranch and everything on it had passed to him through proper legal arrangement. He was saying she owed him for room and board for 7 months, and that she'd left without working that off, and that he'd come to collect what was owed. He was saying all of this to a locked door in a voice calculated to embarrass her into opening it. I stood at the back of the warehouse and listened to this for about 15 seconds. Then I came around to the front and told Ruford Peel to get away from my office door. He turned and looked at me. He was maybe 40, big through the chest, going soft in the middle, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and knew it. He looked me over the way a man looks at someone he's already decided is not a problem. He said this was between him and his cousin, and it wasn't any of my business. I said she worked for me, and she was in my building, and that made it my business. He said she'd stolen from him, and he was within his rights to come collect. I said, what did she steal? He said, a coat, belonged to my wife. I said, a gray wool coat, her mother's coat, the one you sold to a traveling merchant for $7.50. Something shifted in his face. I said, I'm aware of that transaction, and I'm aware of a number of other things, like the fact that the ranch you're claiming went to you through your uncle's estate would be the uncle who also owed this woman 4 months of wages at whatever rate they'd agreed, minus her keep, and that debt passed to you along with the property, and that a 7-month employment without pay, which is what you gave her, is the kind of arrangement that looks a certain way to a judge. His wife Cecile had not said a word since I'd appeared. She was standing a foot behind Ruford with her arms crossed and her eyes moving between the two of us. Ruford said, there was no agreement about wages. I said, she says there was. He said, it's her word against mine. I said, it usually is. And then the judge decides whose word carries more weight, which tends to come down to who's standing there with a clean record and a decent reputation, and who's standing there having just driven 3 days in January to shake down a woman who weighs 115 pounds. He looked at me for a long time, not the easy look from before, something harder and less certain behind it. His wife touched his arm, he shook her off. He said, I want what's owed me. I said, you want $7.50. That's what you got for her coat. I'll give you that and you'll go. He said that wasn't what he'd come for. I said, I know what you came for. You came to take her back to that ranch because you need the labor and you can't make her come otherwise. So you thought if you built up enough of a case, enough debt, enough theft, enough embarrassment, she'd have no choice but to come with you. And I'm telling you that case doesn't exist. She doesn't owe you anything. What you owe her is 4 months' wages and a coat, and I'm prepared to settle the coat on her behalf and call it even if you walk away right now. I reached in my coat and put $7.50 on the rail of the loading dock between us. Ruford Peel looked at the money, then he looked at me, then he looked at his wife who had her eyes on the ground. He picked up the money, put it in his pocket, and said to the door, not to me but to the door, this isn't finished. I said, yes it is. He left, him and Cecil both, back to their horse and down the main street and out of Deering, and I watched them go until they were past the edge of town. Then I knocked on my own office door and said, it's me. The lock turned, and Nora opened the door and looked at me. Her face was very still, not the stillness of fear. Something past fear, that place you get to when you've been afraid for so long that the fear finally burns off, and what's left is just you standing there. I said, they're gone. She said, I heard. She looked at me with those older-than-her-years eyes, and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, you didn't have to do that. I said, I know. She said, the $750, that was your money. I said it was, and it was worth it. She was still looking at me, and there was something in how she was looking, past the stillness, past the careful distance she kept from anything personal, something that had let go of itself a little. Not gratitude, not the heavy debt kind, something else. The look you give someone when you have been carrying a thing alone for a long time and someone has simply stood beside you in it without being asked and without making it into a performance. She stepped forward and put her hand on my arm just for a moment. Her hand was small and her grip was firm. She pressed it once and then let go and stepped back. She said, thank you, Caleb. It was the first time she'd used my name. I nodded. I went back to the livery to check on my horses. The spring came slow and cold that year. The canyon road didn't open until late March, and by then I had 3 months' worth of delayed hauls to make up. I was on the road more than I was in Deering, sometimes gone 2 weeks at a time, up through the canyon and down the backside and into the lower settlements, or north along the plain to the mining camps that were still running. Nora ran the office. This was not a thing I'd planned so much as a thing that happened and then kept happening because it worked. The first time I left, I told her the basics, who was expecting loads and when, who had outstanding balances, which suppliers I had terms with. By the second time I left, she'd already set up a system where all of that was posted on a board on the wall of the office and updated every time anything changed. By the third time, I went through the board with her before I left more as a courtesy than a necessity, because she already knew it better than I did. The freight business, it turns out, requires a fair amount of correspondence when you're not there to speak for yourself. Ranchers write letters about delayed loads. Suppliers write letters about terms. Other freighters write letters about routes and rates and whether certain roads are passable. I had never been a good correspondent. I'd let things pile up and then answered them badly and too late, and it had cost me jobs. Nora answered the letters. The first time she showed me what she'd written, she handed me the stack before I left and said, I've drafted replies to these if you want to look them over. You can change anything you don't agree with. I read through 6 letters. She'd matched each one to what she knew about the situation and the person and the history, and she'd written in a clear, direct voice that was professional without being cold, and she'd committed me to things I could deliver. I handed them back and said, send them. She looked at me, said, you're not going to change anything. I said, no, you said it better than I would have. She looked at the letters and then back at me. Then she took them back and said she'd send them. That was in April. By June, I had 2 new accounts that had come in through the mail. Both of them approached through a letter Nora had written to introduce the business when she'd heard they were looking for a freighter. Neither one had been my idea. The business was growing. Not fast, not dramatically, but steadily, the way a good fire builds from a good bed of coals, quietly and with staying power. I thought about this sometimes, on the road, on the long stretches between settlements when there was nothing to do but watch the country go by and let the horses work. I thought about how the business had looked before, muddy, undersized, running on gut instinct and experience but never quite breaking through into something solid, and how it looked now, with the books current and the billing right and the correspondence going out clean and on time. I thought about what that had required, which was not just the work but the particular intelligence that understood both numbers and people, and I thought about how rare that was. And I thought about how the person who'd brought that into my operation was someone I'd found locked in a smokehouse in November, because a greedy cousin had sold her coat. There is something strange about that when you sit with it, the smallness of the door that a thing comes through, a chance stop on a 2-day haul, a brass lock shining new, the sound under the door. I'd driven past plenty of things in my years, left plenty of other people's trouble where I found it. I couldn't tell you exactly what was different about that day, except that I was 51 and tired, and something in the sound under that door had gone past whatever line I'd drawn for myself and over the one underneath it. I was glad it had. In July she asked me about the canyon. I'd mentioned it in passing, the canyon run, the rock shelf camp, the way the walls came up and the light changed. She'd never been through the canyon in daylight, she said. She'd been through once coming from Missouri, in a stage that went through at night, and she'd slept the whole way. I had a run planned for the end of the month. Window glass again. I seemed to always be hauling glass for a new schoolhouse being built at the bottom of the canyon at a town called Fells Crossing. I asked if she wanted to ride along. She said she'd think about it. The next morning she said yes. We went out on a Tuesday. The canyon that summer was something different than it had been in November, not just temperature, though the temperature was a 40-degree difference, but everything. The walls were red and gold in the morning light, and there were birds in the talus that you never heard in the valley, and the river at the bottom was running green and fast off the snowmelt, and the whole thing had a smell to it, stone and water and something wild underneath. Nora sat on the box seat and watched it all. She didn't say much. She never said much when she was taking something in. It was one of the things I'd learned about her, that she processed the world quietly, without announcing herself, and that the depth of her attention showed in what she said afterward, which was always more considered than you'd expect. We stopped at the rock shelf for midday, same place I'd camped in November. I got the horses water from the river and Nora made coffee on the fire ring, and we sat there on the shelf in the July sun and ate the bread and dried meat she'd packed and drank the coffee and looked at the river. After a while she said, "This is where we camped, isn't it, that night?" I said yes. She said, "I remember the sound of the river." I was half asleep, and I kept thinking it was something else, wind or something, and then I'd come awake and remember where I was. I didn't say anything. She said I was afraid that night, more than I'd let on. I said I'd figured. She said, "Not of you, I mean not then. I'd stopped being afraid of you by then. I was afraid of just everything else, what was next, whether I'd made the right choice." I said, "Had you?" She looked at me sideways, then she looked at the river. She said, "Yes." It was a simple word. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, with no excess around it. Yes. Not building anything onto it or taking anything back. Just, yes, I made the right choice. I looked at the river too. I said, "I'm glad you thought so." She said, it wasn't just gratitude. I want you to know that. I've thought about how to say this and I don't know if I have the right words for it, but I want you to know that what you gave me wasn't just a job or a place to stay. It was being treated like someone worth taking seriously. Like my work mattered. Like what I could do mattered. That's different from just being helped. She paused. Then she said, "I grew up being told I was good at figures and that was fine for a girl but wouldn't amount to anything. And then I came out here and what I found was this. The work. The business. Watching it change because of what I was doing. That's because of you. Because you let it be what it was without making it smaller." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "The work is yours." I didn't do anything except not get in the way. She said, "That's not nothing." I said, "No, I suppose it isn't." The river ran below us, and the shadow of the canyon wall moved slow across the rock. She said, "I'm not going anywhere, Caleb. I want you to know that too. I'm not looking at this as a way station. This is where I am, if that's all right. I said, it's more than all right. She nodded once, just slightly, the way she did when a thing was settled. We sat there a while longer. I was aware of her beside me on the shelf, the particular way she sat, straight-spined but easy, with her feet slightly apart on the rock and her hands loose in her lap, and the way the light came off the water and lit one side of her face. I had been aware of her for months in the way you become aware of something that's always there, her voice in the office, her lamp burning above when I was in late, the smell of coffee she always had going. But it was different out here, in the sun and the open, with the canyon all around. I was 51, and I had been alone for a long time. I did not say anything about that. She reached over and put her hand over mine on the rock, briefly, the way she'd touched my arm in January. This time she didn't let go right away. We sat like that for a while, the river running, the horses drinking, the shadow coming slow down the wall. Then she said, we should get the glass to Fell's Crossing before dark. I said we should. She took her hand back and stood up and brushed off her skirt and went to get her coffee cup from the fire ring. I got up and went to the horses, and we loaded back up and drove on down the canyon. I want to tell you one more thing. It happened in September, near the end of the season. I came back from a 10-day run to find a letter on my desk. It was addressed to me in a hand I didn't recognize, and the return was a law office in a town about 60 miles south. And when I read it, I found that Nora had been inquiring, quietly, on her own, through letters I hadn't known about, into the legal arrangements at the Holt Ranch. Into exactly how the property had passed to Ruford Peel, and on what terms, and whether her uncle's remaining estate, which was apparently more than just the land, had been correctly distributed. The lawyer's letter was careful and formal, but what it said, essentially, was that there were questions. That the arrangement had been made quickly in the days after her uncle's death, by a man Ruford had brought in himself, and that there were irregularities. That if she wanted to pursue it, she had standing to do so. I set the letter down and looked at it for a while. Nora came into the office while I was sitting there. She saw me with the letter and she stopped. I said, "You've been looking into the ranch." She said, "Yes." I said, "How long?" She said, "Since March." After the lawyer in Deering told me there might be something to look at. I said, "You didn't mention it." She said, "I didn't want to mention it until I knew whether it was worth mentioning. I didn't want it to change anything. Here, the work. I didn't want it to look like I was." She stopped. "Then, I didn't want you to think I was only here until I could get something better." I said, "I wouldn't have thought that." She said, "You might have, reasonably." I thought about it. She was probably right. Not because of any failing in her, but because that's the way these things can look when you're on the outside of them. I said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I don't know yet. The ranch, it's a lot of land, a lot of work. And it's Ruford's now, whatever the irregularities. I don't know if I want to spend the next 2 years fighting over it with a man like that." I said, "But..." She said, "But it was my uncle's, and my mother's family's before that. And I'd like to know it was given away right, even if I decide I don't want it back." I said, "That's a fair thing to want to know." She said, "The lawyer says it'll cost about $40 to start the inquiry properly. I have the money from the extra work. I wanted to tell you, since it affects where I'm spending time and attention this fall." I looked at her across the desk. I said, "Get your $40, and if it ends up being more than 40, let me know." She said, "I'm not asking you to pay for it." I said, "I know you're not. I'm offering." She held my eyes for a moment. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because you're worth backing. Same reason I gave you the job. Same reason I raised your wages. I can see what I've got in front of me, Nora. I'm not so old or so thick that I can't see that." She stood there in the office doorway and looked at me, and the lamp was burning between us, and outside it was September dark, and the town was going quiet. She said, "I see what I've got in front of me too, Caleb." Plain, like she said everything. Not an announcement, not a performance, just a thing said clearly because it was true. I said, "Good." She said, "Good." And she came into the office and sat down at the desk, and we went over the fall schedule together, the loads and the routes and what the season looked like. And outside the stock pens were quiet, and the first frost was on the windows of the warehouse, and the lamp burned warm between us. The inquiry took until spring, and it found what Nora had suspected, that the arrangement was not right, that there had been a document, and that the document had been altered, and that Ruford Peel had known. Ruford, faced with that, chose to settle. He paid a sum that I will not name here because it was between him and Nora and the court and nobody else, but it was enough. It was enough that she had a choice. She thought about the ranch for a long time. She wrote letters north and south. She went and looked at it once in the spring, and came back and didn't say much about it for a week. Then one evening she came into the office and sat down across from me and said, "I sold it." I said, "To whom?" She said, "The alderman's. Vera made an offer through the lawyer. She wanted the south pasture, and Ruford's buyer didn't make sense without it, so it worked." I said, "That was a good price, probably." She said, "It was a very good price." She had her hands flat on the desk, the way she did when she'd arrived at something after thinking it through completely. She said, "I want to invest half of it in the business. As a partner, proper partnership with papers. I've talked to the lawyer already. The way the freight business is growing, there's a point in the next 2 years where you're going to need a second warehouse and probably a third team of horses, and maybe a partner with capital anyway. I'd rather it be me than someone you have to go find." I said, "In the other half?" She said, "Savings. I've been poor. I don't intend to be poor again." I said, "You want to be a partner in a freight operation?" She said, "I want to be a partner in this freight operation. There's a difference." I looked at her. There is a thing that happens when a person who is capable and clear-eyed and knows exactly what they're about makes a decision to put themselves into something with you. It's not a small thing. It doesn't feel the way I would have expected, which would have been some kind of warm swell of feeling. It felt more like weight, good weight, the weight of something real and solid, set down at last in the right place. I said, "You want it in writing?" She said, "Of course I want it in writing. I'm an accountant." I said, "Half the business is worth more than half the current value of the ranch sale." She said, "I know, I did the figures. I'm not paying for the current value. I'm paying for where it's going." I looked at her across the desk in the lamplight. I said, "I think that's a reasonable arrangement." She said, "I thought you'd see it that way." She put her hand on the desk between us, open. Not a business handshake that would come later with the papers. Just a hand, open, on the desk between us. I put mine on top of it. We sat like that for a moment. Her hand was warm and her grip was certain, and the lamp burned between us, and outside it was spring and the canyon road was open, and there was freight to be moved. I said, "I'm going to need to reconfigure the route schedule for a second team." She said, "I've already started on it." I said, "Of course you have." She almost smiled. Then she did smile fully for the first time without putting it away. It was a good smile, the kind that had been earned. That was 7 years ago now. The business has 3 warehouses and 4 teams and 2 drivers beside myself, and Nora runs the office and the books and the correspondence, and has done since the beginning. The canyon road is different now, better graded, wider in the bad stretches, but I still stop at the rock shelf when I come through out of habit and look down at the river. I think about that November sometimes, that particular shape a day can take, the brass lock and the sound under the door and the decision to get the pry bar, which was nothing more than an ordinary choice made by a man who finally paid attention at the right moment. Nora is in the office when I get back from the road always. Lamp burning, coffee going, the board on the wall updated. She looks up when I come in and she tells me what's changed while I was gone, and I tell her what the roads are like and we go over what needs to happen next. It is not a complicated thing, what we have. It is plain and solid and honest in the way a good load strapped down for a long haul is honest. Nothing wasted, nothing loose, everything exactly where it ought to be. She chose to be here. That is the part I never lose sight of. She looked at this work and this man and this life, and she chose it with open eyes and full knowledge. She is good and she is strong and she has her own mind and she chose it anyway. That's the thing about a good woman. When she gives you something, it means something because she could have given it elsewhere. Outside the stock pens are quiet, and the first light of morning is coming up over the canyon rim. And in a minute, she's going to put a cup of coffee on the corner of the desk where I always set my hat when I come in. And I'm going to hang my hat and drink the coffee and we're going to go over the week. There are worse things in this world. There are considerably worse things.